frustration, death, persistence, and triumph. Roguelikes have surged in popularity in the indie scene over the past couple of years, especially with the breakout success of both the Binding of Isaac games. With such a jump in the number of roguelikes in the past few years, it's both exciting and daunting to sift through these games to find one that will best suit your tastes. Exciting because as more developers recognise their ability to define the experience almost entirely through their game mechanics, more variants and a higher number of qualities can be seen poking through. Yet it's daunting due to the number you may have to play or take a look at that just don't suit your style of play at all. Now I'm going to assume that you know what a roguelike is just by judging the fact that you're watching this video, and the games that I'm going to recommend aren't going to be to everyone's tastes, otherwise I would have called this 3 roguelikes you must play. Without further ado, I'll start with the game that's in early access right now, but I will hopefully abate any fears about picking this game up, despite the tag. Dead Cells is a game born from an unlikely source. Their developer Motion Twin has been making free browser and mobile-based games for 17 years as of 2018. The developer has found the mobile market overcrowded and extremely competitive, and so embarked on the passion project that became Dead Cells. Motion Twin's development history may cause a worry for Dead Cells at a first glance, but the words passion project are exemplified in just how much of a departure this game is from their previous titles. Now this game technically falls under the roguelike category, but I'm letting those kind of pedantic details fall by the wayside in this case, as roguelites are still a subgenre of the wider term of roguelike. There are 2 types of currency, typical gold and cells. Gold is used for getting new weapons and traps in shops, and opening certain doors, usually to get more items. Cells are your valuable currency, which you'll use to spend on permanent items and upgrades. I'll talk about cells more than gold, as gold is sort of self-explanatory in this case. Once you finish a stage, you can't spend cells whenever you want. You'll get an opportunity to spend them, but you cannot leave the hub until you invest them all and proceed to the next area. Do you choose to invest in something long-term and add an additional charge to that ever-important health flask, or obtain a useful weapon and item more quickly? If you do the latter, I find it a nice touch that the game instantly hands you that item scaled to whatever stage you unlock it, just to try it out. It's a satisfying progression curve that I don't know how to describe.
Once again, I'm back in the lab, cleaning my knives, ready for stabs.
Yeah, that'll do. A typical run starts with choosing a starting weapon that will usually be a sword, a shield, or a bow with a choice of 2 of them. This selection will be wider in scope as you invest more cells into your weapons. There's differences in terms of speed and damage relating to each type of sword and shield or long-range weapon with different effects. This creates weapons that are sort of semi-clones of each other, while some swords may be faster, and other swords may apply stat debuffs. Each piece of equipment is designated a colour. Red is brutality, purple is tactics, and blue is survival. Blue is survival, it's green. I've actually put down on the script, blue is survival. God, fuck. Swords and some long-range weapons are usually red, with most traps and bows being purple, and shields usually being green, survival-based. Through each run, you'll look to enhance your stats with scrolls of power that can give you the choice of upping your brutality, tactics, or survival, which will add damage bonuses and effects to the related equipment and also increase your max health by a certain percent. A lot of your choice can be informed on the path you happen to be taking. Picked up a lot of traps? Increase your tactics for better damage and cooldown time. Swinging around a powerful sword? Increase your brutality to increase its base damage, health, and gaining damage bonuses after successive kills. It's simple, it's neat, and it's easy to understand and pick up quickly. In terms of actual combat, enemies telegraph their attacks a lot in the early levels, but so do you. Even though you move fast, you have to commit to each input as there is a small wind-up time for most weapons. Enemies will often be thrown together in the same room as well. Usually a mix of short and long-range attacks will be thrown at you as a result, and fending off aggressive attacks whilst being aware of incoming fire and other threats presents a choice of approach in terms of which enemy to deal with first, teaching target priority. As you get to know the enemy types better, you'll become better at this, which is what I meant when I said that the experience and teaching done in these games is done just by playing. Levels tend to be pretty large for a roguelike, hence the Roguevania title in the marketing. Dead Cells' levels have distinct enough enemies and layout behaviours to make them distinguishable from one another, which lends itself to the tag again. The toxic sewers have hazards and enemies that are designed to poison you. The Promenade of the Condemned has enemies that can shield others from incoming damage whilst throwing platform hazards at you like spikes. The ossuary is fucking hard, you get the idea. However, this kind of design can clash with the combat presented. Metroidvanias by nature tend to have quite a lot of verticality in them, leaving the designers another axis to work with confidently, and can make the world feel large and sprawling rather than just constantly advancing to the right. Issues crop up when Dead Cell's mostly horizontal combat focus comes into conflict with trying to move upwards whilst on the offensive or trying to kill flying enemies out of your reach. There's no way to swing your sword up or down when you attack in the air, and you suddenly gain the ability to hover, but only for a second. In terms of design, it can feel like the levels are just as planned out as other Metroidvanias like Hollow Knight, in the way that certain tiles flow together. But it also clashes with the randomly generated philosophy, in that sometimes the levels can look like tiles that have just been slapped together, with stuff like dead-end corridors and doors leading into rooms with nothing in them. The levels also have sparse areas that rely on certain abilities you need to progress, again not unlike a Metroidvania. However, these need to be used sparingly and for extra rewards, rather than going for actual progress, as due to the random nature of roguelikes, a player could potentially go countless runs without obtaining these abilities, and would be isolated into a particular level. These kinds of abilities in Metroidvanias are supposed to inspire a sense of recognition of where and how to use the ability, because you will have more than likely run into temporary dead ends that will be opened up with such abilities. Dead Cells misses the mark in terms of these abilities thanks to the previous problem. Rather than leading to new content, it would just lead to an area with more enemies and a chest, which you could wander into without having these abilities at all. That being said, these areas are usually harder to get through, and the rewards at the end are usually worth it, depending on your playstyle. And the game would be worse off without them. I just think that they could be implemented a little better. Overall, Dead Cells is a fantastic entry into the genre, with crunchy combat, a satisfying progression curve, and only very few hiccups in its level design. The game has also been seeing regular updates consistently, so you'll have something new to look forward to almost always. Now, while Dead Cells was quite combat-oriented, let's shift focus a little bit. Celador Games clearly had a strong start with their flash game Don't Shit Your Pants, but have since been going through a rough patch since their release of Full Metal Furies. But Celador has been the definition of peaks and troughs, and Rogue Legacy was their peak. Rogue Legacy was the company's debut into Steam, with little nods to their previous efforts in developing web browser games strewn throughout the game itself. It's safe to say that this was their most ambitious product to date, and it paid off. In fact, they managed to earn the $15,000 budget back in just an hour after the game's release. Surely a testament to its quality. Now, in Rogue Legacy, combat is incredibly simple compared to Dead Cells on a mechanical level. You generally just swing your sword and cast a spell. But this game would be a shame if it made that its sticking point, and by the fact that it's on this list, I think you know that it goes deeper. Oh no, this isn't a combat-focused roguelike like Dead Cells. This is an out-and-out platformer at heart. The controls are insanely tight, with you being able to adjust your movement down to the minute detail, whether you're on the ground or in the air, using runes that give you Metroidvania-like abilities for traversing challenging and complex scenarios and tiles, as well as having long and short-range enemies being thrown at you from all sides, creates the feeling of a compatible, comprehensive, and fluid design. So combat becomes an interweaving of platforming, target priority, and mechanical skill that usually manifests itself in you having to engage in combat whilst platforming, which makes the rewards gained from conquering such challenges feel genuinely worth it. Unlike Dead Cells, a lot of what can dictate your run through a given level is both randomized and also your choice, as each time you die, the heir of your character that just died will take the reins. Rogue Legacy doesn't have many classes right off the bat, but before long you'll have a fair amount to choose from. There are your standard classes like mages and paladins, but the further you invest in your classes in the more interesting they get, like the spell swords and liches that gain MP and maximum HP upon kills respectively, as well as the ability to upgrade existing classes to give them new abilities. There is a comprehensive list of ways to play. In terms of progression, there's only really one catch-all currency, and this time it's more versatile in its use. Gold is used to upgrade your stats and get new classes, with other bonuses like upping critical hit rates and making each gold pickup permanently more valuable. You can also buy equipment which increase your stats more significantly and immediately, but you have a weight limit to how much you can equip, which can be upped using gold as well. There are runes which give you abilities which make traversal easier, like I mentioned earlier, and are really handy for those chests that seem impossible to get to in the early game. And like Dead Cells, you have to spend all of your gold to get back into the castle, but with varying costs, and playing optimally requires you to use those mental math skills that you always lie about. In terms of area design, rather than the whole levels being traversable on one screen, you switch from screen to screen Mega Man style, and you won't know what you're running into unless you get in there and see for yourself, which can end up in you taking some cheap hits, but these are few and far between. It manages to avoid the accidental, superfluous and dead-end design of some of Dead Cell's maps I mentioned earlier, as the developers just have to slap tiles together that are designed without having to worry about what it would be connected to. So most are well thought out in terms of the objective. For example, there's a huge room with lots of enemies. Kill them. Or there's a room with a lot of hazards that you need to use your room or just your mechanical movement skill to get your reward. So upon entering these rooms, you have a distinct sense of what your objective is and how to approach it. In terms of areas, there are 4. The castle is in the middle, the forest is to the right, the mire is at the top, and the darkness is at the bottom. However, none of them really have a distinct theme like Dead Cell's areas do, apart from the darkness, which is pretty obvious. The only thing that differs are enemy types specific to each area and enemies which mix it up by adding new nuances to established attacks, such as more aggression or projectiles. So even though certain enemies may seem familiar, whilst they mix it up, you'll have to figure out their new nuances as you go through each area. However, a genuine weakness this game has in its level design is the lack of an ability to get to areas that you're more suited to quicker. It can feel like a bit of a slog going through the castle in the late game, as you'll be rushing and will more than likely take unnecessary damage on the way to where your run should start. This could be fixed by adding a shortcut door that you have to find in each area and you can transport there. But this is only a small detractor in terms of its design when looking at the big picture. Rogue Legacy seems similar to Dead Cells in a lot of ways, and that's because it sort of is. It's an action-based roguelike with Metroidvania elements. But the focus of Rogue Legacy relies on its platforming mechanics being used in tandem with its combat to create scenarios that are both extremely challenging, fast-paced, and rewarding. And it's yet another game on this list that does well to lend itself to conveying its experience through its mechanics. Though you may be thinking that all this hopping, skipping, and jumping around the place seems a little fast-paced, which is why I'm taking it down a notch with this final recommendation. Dungeon of the Endless is a game in the Endless series along with Endless Legend and Endless Space, developed by Amplitude Studios. My understanding is that these games are sort of linked in terms of story, but it's pretty tenuous, so there's not too much to worry about. Amplitude based their development and updates on suggestions from crowdfunders to create an apparently player-centered experience. I want to preface this recommendation by saying I'm not sure that there is anything that I can myself subjectively criticize, since this game is pretty much to my tastes to a T. However, this is the game of the 3 that will appeal to a certain audience, and will be the most divisive. And it's a very different roguelike from Dead Cells and Rogue Legacy, and the best way to explain this game is kind of like a reverse tower defense? Look, I'll get into that later, but I'll start from the top. You start out next to the core of your crashed ship, which you have to use to power the elevators on each floor. The trick is, you have to find them first. Once you find said elevator, you have to physically move your core to it whilst enemies swarm you. To move the core, you also have to use one of your characters, and they move a lot slower than their based speed. Hence the decision to have the player start each run with at least 2 characters, rather than just 1. You'll see why this game is an outlier on this list, as unlike the previous 2 games, it's very different in terms of its level design, in that there isn't much to work off here. It's mainly just square and rectangular rooms of varying size, but this will be important in dictating your strategy for each floor. And another thing that will dictate your strategy is your resources, and there are 4 of them to manage in this game: industry, food, science, and dust. Industry is used to build various mechanisms with a variety of effects on these nodes. They can be anything from damage-dealing turrets and area of effect machines to buffs and debuffs for allies and enemies in that specific room. So there's a lot of variety. So right off the bat, industry is incredibly important to manage and use wisely in the right places, to essentially create choke points to stop enemies from getting to your core and dealing damage, and creating a safe haven for your characters whilst they venture out to find the elevator. Industry is also used to build terminals, which increase the amount of industry, food, or science you gain after opening a new room, or each turn, as it were. Do you open up more of the map and get a better sense of where the enemies are coming from? Or do you not risk it and hunker down immediately with less gain of resources in the long term? There is decision making in mechanics here rather than any kind of fixed story path, which we see quite a bit nowadays, and it's refreshing to see it exemplified in gameplay. The next source is food, and it has 3 uses. One is to upgrade your characters, which increases their stats and adds special abilities, and the next is to heal instantly in the middle of a fight, which is a safety net in case your characters become overwhelmed, and finally, it is used to recruit new characters into your party, upping your starting size of 2 up to a maximum of 4. Now, I called using food to heal as a contingency because it detracts from the much more useful uses of food. If you upgrade a character enough, you don't need to spend as much industry to hold a choke point, as they can be repurposed as a stronger tower depending on the character. And getting more of these characters and having more food to upgrade them means that you cover more areas and balance out your expenditure of all your resources. Admittedly, this will depend on where the enemies are coming from and how powerful they are, so it can feel like your characters can get overwhelmed too easily, especially in the mid-game, oddly enough. Moving onward, we have Science, which is used to get new turrets and mechanisms, as well as upgrading existing ones. You get a choice of 3 and takes a certain number of turns to complete. You can use them multiple times in a level as well, so there's a choice to be made if you find the elevator early. Do you risk the onslaught of more enemies waiting for the research to finish, or do you continue with potentially underdeveloped towers? Researching and gaining resources require the same objective of opening more doors to explore. So again, if the player balances their resources, they can gain a significant advantage in all areas. Balanced management leads to a steady growth. And the last resource is dust, and this is what's used to power your rooms. If a room isn't powered, then anything from towers to terminals to buff and debuff devices in it won't work. And there also must be a clear line of dust-powered rooms to your core. With this, you have to sort of engage in a guessing game as to what lines the enemy will take and where would be best to place your towers. You also lose dust every time your core gets hit, which means you will have to be on top of your lines. This can lead to situations of enemies coming in from an unknown location that you weren't prepared for and weren't given any indication of such, which can lead to your core or towers getting wrecked even with a solid setup. This doesn't tend to happen as often as enemies usually spawn from rooms that are far away enough for you to react, but it can still feel really cheap. Dungeon of the Endless is much more about resource management and strategic placing than any kind of mechanical skill. I chose this to recommend last on this list because it is so different to the other two. With a nice slow pace for those who love watching plans come together, alone or in co-op, this is a different flavour of roguelike that is greatly appreciated. Roguelikes are a genre I've really come to appreciate in the indie scene over the past few years. Some of my favourite games in my library belong to the genre, but like hack and slashes, I feel like a lot get made but are undervalued or underdeveloped in concept. So when games like Dead Cells, Rogue Legacy and Dungeon of the Endless come along, it's a real treat for me. There were many other games that I could have put on this list, but I didn't want to drone on about similar mechanics for too long, and a top 3 seems like a good number. Even if you don't check it out, I'm glad that I got the opportunity to play through these games again and gain a real appreciation for these developers defining the experiences of their games through their mechanics. Thank you very much for watching.